Georgie moved away from the telephone, feeling immensely busy. There was so much to think about and to do. The first thing was to speak about the oysters, and his parlour-maid being out, he called down the kitchen stairs. The absence of Foljam made it necessary for him to get his bath ready himself, and he turned the hot water tap half on, so that he could run downstairs again and out into the garden, for there was not time to finish the lawn if he was to have a bath and change before tea, in order to put the roller back in the shed. Then he had to get his clothes out and select something which would do for tea and also for dinner, as Lucia had told him not to dress. There was a new suit which he had not worn yet, rather daring, for the trousers, dark fawn, were distinctly of Oxford cut, and he felt quite boyish as he looked at them. He had ordered them in a moment of reckless sartorial courage, and a quiet tea with Daisy Quantock, followed by a quiet dinner with Lucia, was just the way to make a beginning with them. Far better than wearing them for the first time at church on Sunday, when the whole of Risholm simultaneously would see them. The coat and waistcoat were very dark blue. They would look blue at tea and black at dinner. And there were some grey silk socks, rather silvery, and a tie to match them. These took some time to find, and his search was interrupted by volumes of steam pouring into his bedroom from his bathroom. He ran in to find the bath fully nearly to the brim of boiling water. It had been little more than lukewarm yesterday, and his cook had evidently taken to heart his 2 sharp words after breakfast this morning. So he had to pull up the plug of his bath to let the boiling water content subside and fill up with cold. He went back to his bedroom and began undressing. All this news about Lucia and Peppino, with Daisy Quantock's penetrating comments, was intensely interesting. Old Miss Lucas had been in this nursing home or private asylum for years, and Georgie didn't suppose that the inclusive charges could be less than £15 a week, and 15 times 52 was a large sum. That was income, too, and say it was at 5%, the capital it represented was considerable. Then there was that house in London. If it was freehold, that meant a great deal more capital. If it was on lease, it meant a great deal more income. Then there were rates and taxes and the wages of a caretaker, and no doubt a margin. And there were pearls. Georgie took a half-sheet of paper from the drawer in a writing table, where he kept half-sheets and pieces of string untied from parcels, and began to calculate. There was necessarily a great deal of guesswork about it, and the pearls had to be omitted altogether, since nobody could say what pearls were worth without knowing their quantity or quality. But even omitting these, and putting quite a low figure on the possible rent of the house near Harrods, he was astounded at the capital which these annual outgoings appeared to represent. "I don't put it at a penny less than £50,000, he said to himself, and the income at 2,600. He had got a little chilly as he sat at his figures, and with a luxurious foretaste of a beautiful hot bath, he hurried into his bathroom. The whole of the boiling water had run out. "How tiresome! Damn," said Georgie, putting in the plug and turning on both taps simultaneously. His calculations, of course, had only been the materials on which his imagination built, and as he dressed it was hard at work, between glances at his trousers as reflected in the full-length mirror which stood in his window. What would Lucia and Peppino do with this vast increase of fortune? Lucia already had the biggest house in Risholm, and the most Elizabethan decor, and a motor, and as many new clothes as she chose. She did not spend much on them because her lofty mind despised clothes, but Georgie permitted himself to indulge cynical reflections that the pearls might make her dressier. Then she already entertained as much as she felt disposed, and more money would not make her wish to give more dinners. And she went up to London whenever there was anything in the way of pictures or plays or music which she felt held the seed of culture. Society, so-called, she despised as thoroughly as she despised clothes, and always said she came back to Risholm feeling intellectually starved. Perhaps she could endow a permanent fund for holding May Day revels. on the village green, for Lucia had said she meant to have May Day revels every year. They had been a great success last year, though fatiguing, for everybody dressed up in 16th century costume and danced Morris dances till they all hobbled home dead lame at the merciful sunset. It had all been wonderfully Elizabethan, and Georgie's jerkin had hurt him very much. Lucia was a wonderful character, thought Georgie, and she would find a way to spend 2,000 or 3,000 a year more in an edifying and cultured manner. Were Oxford trousers meant to turn up at the bottom? He thought not. And how small these voluminous folds made your feet look. Georgie knew what he himself would do with 2,000 or 3,000 a year more. Indeed, he had often considered whether he would not try to do it without. He wanted ever so much to have a little flat in London, or a couple of rooms would serve, just for a dip every now and then in the life which Lucia found so vapid. But he knew he wasn't a strong, serious character like Lucia, whose only frivolities were artistic or Elizabethan. His eye fell on a large photograph on the table by his bedside in a silver frame, representing Brunhilde. It was signed, Olga to beloved Georgie, and his waistcoat felt quite tight as, drawing in a long breath, he recalled that wonderful 6 months when Olga Bracely, the prima donna, had bought Old Place and lived here, and had altered all the values of everything. Georgie believed himself to have been desperately in love with her, but it had been a very exciting time for more reasons than that. Old values had gone. She had thought Risholme the most splendid joke that had ever been made. She loved them all and laughed at them all, and nobody minded a bit, but followed her whims as if she had been a Pied Piper. All but Lucia, that is to say, whose throne had, quite unintentionally on Olga's part, been pulled smartly from under her, and her scepter flew in one direction and her crown in another. Then Olga had gone off for an operatic tour in America, and after 6 triumphant months there, had gone on to Australia. But she would be back in England by now, for she was singing in London this season, and her house at Risholme, so long closed, would be open again. And the coat buttoned beautifully, just the last button, leaving the rest negligently wide and a little loose. Georgie put an amethyst tie-pin in his grey tie, which gave a pretty touch of color, brushed his hair back from his forehead so that the toupee was quite indistinguishable from his own hair, and hurried downstairs to go out to tea with Daisy Quantock. Daisy was seated at her writing table when he entered, very busy with a pencil and piece of paper, and counting something up on her fingers. Her gardening fork lay in the grate with the fire-irons. On the carpet there were 1 or 2 little sausages of garden mold, which no doubt had peeled off from her boots, and her gardening gloves were on the floor by her side. Georgie instantly registered the conclusion that something important must have occurred, and that she had come indoors in a great hurry, because the carpet was nearly new, and she always made a great fuss if the smallest atom of a cigarette ash fell on it. 37, 47, 52, and carry 5, she muttered, as Georgie stood in front of the fire so that the entire new suit should be seen at once. Wait a minute, Georgie. And 17 and 5's 23. No, 22, and that's put me out. I must begin again. That can't be right. Help yourself if De Vere has brought in tea, and if not, ring. Oh, I left out the 4, and altogether it's £2,500. Georgie had thought at first that Daisy was merely doing some belated household accounts, but the moment she said £2,500, he guessed, and did not even go through the formality of asking what was £2,500. I made it 2,600, he said, but we're pretty well agreed. Naturally, Daisy understood that he understood. Perhaps you reckoned the pearls as capital, she said, and added the interest. No, I didn't, he said. How could I tell how much they were worth? I didn't reckon them in at all. Well, it's a lot of money, said Daisy. Let's have tea. What will she do with it? She seemed quite blind to the Oxford trousers, and Georgie wondered whether that was from mere feebleness of vision. Daisy was short-sighted, though she steadily refused to recognize that and would never wear spectacles. In fact, Lucia had made an unkind little epigram about it at a time when there was a slight coolness between the two, and had said, "Dear Daisy is too short-sighted to see how short-sighted she is." Of course it was unkind, but very brilliant, and Georgie had read through The Importance of Being Earnest, which Lucia had gone up to town to see in the hopes of discovering it. Or was Daisy's unconsciousness of his trousers merely due to her preoccupation with Lucia's probable income? Or were the trousers, after all, not so daring as he had thought them? He sat down, with one leg thrown carelessly over the arm of his chair, so that Daisy could hardly fail to see it. Then he took a piece of tea cake. "Yes, do tell me what you think she will do with it," he asked. "I've been puzzling over it, too." "I can't imagine," said Daisy. "She's got everything she wants now. Perhaps they'll just hoard it, in order that when Peppino dies we may all see how much richer he was than we ever imagined. That's too posthumous for me. Give me what I want now, and a pauper's funeral afterwards." "Me too," said Georgie, waving his leg. "But I don't think Lucia will do that. It did occur to me—" "The house in London, you mean," said Daisy, swiftly interrupting. "Of course, if they kept both houses open, with a staff in each, so that they could run up and down as they chose, that would make a big hole in it. Lucia has always said that she couldn't live in London, but she may manage it, if she's got a house there." "I'm dining with her tonight," said Georgie. "Perhaps she'll say something." Mrs. Quantock was very thirsty with her gardening, and the tea was very hot. She poured it into her saucer and blew on it. "Lucia would be wise not to waste any time," she said, "if she intends to have any fun out of it. For you know, Georgie, we're beginning to get old. I'm 52. How old are you?" Georgie disliked that barbarous sort of question. He had been the young man of Risholme so long that the habit was ingrained, and he hardly believed that he was 48. 43, he said. "But what does it matter how old we are, as long as we're busy and amused? And I'm sure Lucia has got all the energy in life she ever had. I shouldn't be a bit surprised if she made a start in London and went in for all that. Then, of course, there's Peppino, but he only cares for writing his poetry and looking through his telescope." "I hate that telescope," said Daisy. "He took me up on the roof the other night and showed me what he said was Mars. And I'll take my oath he said that the same one was Venus only a week before. But as I couldn't see anything either time, it didn't make much difference." The door opened, and Mr. Quantock came in. Robert was like a little round, brown, sarcastic beetle. Georgie got up to greet him and stood in the full blaze of the light. Robert certainly saw his trousers, for his eyes seemed unable to quit the spreading folds that lay round Georgie's ankles. He looked at them as if he was Cortez and they were some new planet. Then, without a word, he folded his arms and danced a few steps of what was clearly meant to be a sailor's hornpipe. "Heave-ho, Georgie," he said. "Belay there, and avast." "What is he talking about?" said Daisy. Georgie, quite apart from his general good nature, always strove to propitiate Mr. Quantock. He was far the most sarcastic person in Risholme, and could say sharp things straight off, whereas Georgie had to think a long time before he got a nasty edge to any remark, and then his good nature generally forbade him to slash with it. "He's talking about my new clothes," he said, "and he's being very naughty. Any news?" Any news was the general gambit of conversation in Risholme. It could not have been bettered, for there always was news, and there was now. "Yes, Peppino's gone to the station," said Mr. Quantock. "Just like a large black crow. Waved a black hand. Bah! Why not call a release and have done with it? And if you don't know, why, I'll tell you. It's because they're rolling in riches. Why, I've calculated. Yes, said Daisy and Georgie simultaneously. So you've been calculating too, said Mr. Quantock. Might have a sweepstake for the one who gets nearest. I say 3,000 a year. Not so much, said Georgie and Daisy again simultaneously. All right, but that's no reason why I shouldn't have a lump of sugar in my tea. Dear me, no, said Daisy genially. But how do you make it up to 3,000? By addition, said this annoying man. There'll be every penny of that. I was at the lending library after lunch, and those who could add made it all that. Daisy turned to Georgie. You'll be alone with Lucia then tonight? Oh, I knew that, said Georgie. She told me Peppino had gone. I expect he's sleeping in that house tonight. Mr. Quantock produced his calculations, and the argument waxed hot. It was still raging when Georgie left in order to get a little rest before going on to dinner and to practice the Mozart duet. He and Lucia hadn't tried it before, so it was as well to practice both parts and let her choose which she liked. Foljam had come back from her afternoon out and told him that there had been a trunk call for him while he was at tea, but she could make nothing of it. Somebody in a great hurry, sir, she said, and kept asking if I was, excuse me, sir, if I was Georgie. I kept saying I wasn't, but I'd fetch you. That wouldn't do, and she said she'd telegraph. But who was it? Asked Georgie. Couldn't say, sir. She never gave a name, but only kept asking. She? Asked Georgie. Sounded like one, said Foljam. Most mysterious, said Georgie. It couldn't be either of his sisters, for they sounded not like a she, but a he. And so he lay down on his sofa to rest a little, before he took a turn at the Mozart. The evening had turned chilly, and he put on his blue cape with a velvet collar to trot across to Lucia's house. The parlour-maid received him with a faint, haggard smile of recognition, and then grew funereal again, and preceding him, not at her usual brisk pace, but sadly and slowly, opened the door of the music-room and pronounced his name in a mournful whisper. It was a gay, cheerful room, in the ordinary way. Now only one light was burning, and from the deepest of the shadows there came a rustling, and Lucia rose to meet him. Georgie, dear, she said, good of you. Georgie held her hand a moment longer than was usual, and gave it a little extra pressure for the conveyance of sympathy. Lucia, to acknowledge that, pressed a little more, and Georgie tightened his grip again to show that he understood, until their respective fingernails grew white with the conveyance and reception of sympathy. It was rather agonizing, because a bit of skin on his little finger had got caught between two of the rings on his third finger, and he was glad when they quite understood each other. Of course, it was not to be expected that in these first moments Lucia should notice his trousers. She herself was dressed in deep mourning, and Georgie thought he recognized the little cap she wore as being that which had faintly expressed her grief over the death of Queen Victoria. But black suited her, and she certainly looked very well. Dinner was announced immediately, and she took Georgie's arm, and with faltering steps they went into the dining-room. Georgie had determined that his role was to be sympathetic but bracing. Lucia must rally from this blow, and her suggestion that he should bring the Mozart duet was hopeful. And though her voice was low and unsteady, she did say, as they sat down, Any news? I've hardly been outside my house and garden all day, said Georgie, rolling the lawn. And Daisy Quantock, did you know, has had a row with her gardener, and is going to do it all herself. So there she was next door with a fork and a wheelbarrow full of manure. Lucia gave a wan smile. Dear Daisy, she said, what a garden it will be. Anything else? Yes, I had tea with them, and while I was out, there was a trunk call for me. So tiresome. Whoever it was couldn't make any way, and she's going to telegraph. I can't imagine who it was. I wonder, said Lucia, in an interested voice. Then she recollected herself again. I had a sort of presentiment, Georgie, when I saw that telegram for Peppino on the table 2 days ago, that it was bad news. Curious, said Georgie. And what delicious fish! How do you always manage to get better things than any of us? It tastes of the sea, and I am so hungry after all my work. Lucia went firmly on. I took it to poor Peppino, she said, and he got quite white. And then, so like him, he thought of me. It's bad news, darling, he said, and we've got to help each other to bear it. So like Peppino, said Georgie. Mr. Quantock saw him going to the station. Where is he going to sleep tonight? Lucia took a little more fish. In Auntie's house in Brompton Square, she said. So that's where it is, thought Georgie. If there was a light anywhere in Daisy's house, except in the attics, he would have to go in for a minute on his return home and communicate the news. Oh, she had a house there, had she? He said. Yes, a charming house, said Lucia, and full, of course, of dear old memories to Peppino. It will be very trying for him, for he used to go there when he was a boy to see Auntie. And has she left it him? Asked Georgie, trying to make his voice seem unconcerned. Yes, and it's a freehold, said Lucia. That makes it easier to dispose of if Peppino settles to sell it. And beautiful Queen Anne furniture. My dear, how delicious, said Georgie. Probably worth a fortune. Lucia was certainly rallying from the terrible blow, but she did not allow herself to rally too far, and shook her head sadly. Peppino would hate to have to part with Auntie's things, she said. So many memories. He can recollect her sitting at the walnut bureau, one of those tall ones, you know, which let down in front, and the handles of the drawers all original, doing her accounts in the morning, and a picture of her with her pearls over the fireplace by Sargent, quite an early one. Some fine Chinese Chippendale chairs in the dining room. We must try to keep some of the things. Georgie longed to ask 100 questions, but it would not be wise, for Lucia was so evidently enjoying letting these sumptuous details leak out, mingled with memories. He was beginning to feel sure that Daisy's cynical suggestion was correct, and that the stricken desolation of Peppino and Lucia cloaked a very substantial inheritance. Bits of exultation kept peeping out, and Lucia kept poking them back. But where will you put all those lovely things if you sell the house? He asked. Your house here is so perfect already. Nothing is settled yet, said Lucia. Neither he nor I can think of anything but dear Auntie. Such a keen, intelligent mind she had when Peppino first remembered her. Very good-looking, still in the Sargent picture, and it was all so sudden. When Peppino saw her last, she was so full of vigor. That was the time she bit him, thought Georgie. Aloud he said, Of course you must feel it dreadfully. What is the Sargent? A Kit-Kat or a full-length? Full-length, I believe, said Lucia. I don't know where we could put it here. But of course it is not possible to think about that yet. A glass of port? I'm going to give you one, said Georgie. It's just what you want, after all your worries and griefs. Lucia pushed her glass towards him. Just half a glass, she said. You are so dear and understanding, Georgie. I couldn't talk to anyone but you, and perhaps it does me good to talk. There is some wonderful port in Auntie's cellar, Peppino says. She rose. Let us go into the music room, she said, and then play our Mozart if I feel up to it. That'll do you good too, said Georgie. Lucia felt equal to having more illumination than there had been when she rose out of the shadows before dinner, and they established themselves quite cozily by the fire. "There will be a terrible lot of business for Peppino," she said. "Luckily his lawyer is the same firm as Auntie's, and quite a family friend. Whatever Auntie had, so he told us, goes to Peppino, though we haven't really any idea what it is. But with death duties and succession duties, I know we shall have to be prepared to be very poor until they are paid off. And the duties increase so iniquitously in proportion to the inheritance. Then everything in Brompton Square has to be valued, and we have to pay on the entire contents. The very carpets and rugs are priced, and some are beautiful Persians. And then there's the valuer to pay, and all the lawyers' charges. And when all that has been paid and finished, there is the higher super tax." "But there's a bigger income," said Georgie. "Yes, that's one way of looking at it," said Lucia. "But Peppino says that the charges will be enormous. And there's a beautiful music room." Lucia gave him one of her rather gimlet-like looks. "Giorgino, I suppose everybody in Risholme is all agog to know what Peppino has been left. That is so dreadfully vulgar. But I suppose it's natural. Is everybody talking about it?" "Well, I have heard it mentioned," said Georgie, "but I don't see why it's vulgar. I'm interested in it myself. It concerns you and Peppino, and what concerns one's friends must be of interest to one." "Caro, I know that," said Lucia, "but so much more than the actual money is the responsibility it brings. Peppino and I have all we want for our quiet little needs, and now this great increase of wealth is coming to us. Great, that is, compared to our modest little income now. And as I say, it brings its responsibilities. We shall have to use wisely, and without extravagance, whatever is left after all these immense expenses have been paid. That meadow at the bottom of the garden, of course, we shall buy at once, so that there will no longer be any fear of its being built over and spoiling the garden. And then perhaps a new telescope for Peppino. But what do I want in Risholme beyond what I've got? Music and friends, and the power to entertain them, my books, and my flowers. Perhaps a library built on at the end of the wing where Peppino can be undisturbed. And perhaps every now and then a string quartet down from London. That will give a great deal of pleasure, and music is more than pleasure, isn't it?" Again she turned the gimlet look onto Georgie. "And then there's the house in Brompton Square," she said, "where Auntie was born. Are we to sell that?" Georgie guessed exactly what was in her mind. It had been in his, too, ever since Lucia had alluded to the beautiful music room. Her voice had lingered over the beautiful music room. She had seemed to underline it, to caress it, to appropriate it. "I believe you are thinking of keeping the house and partly living there," he said. Lucia looked round, as if 100 eavesdroppers had entered unaware. "Hush, Georgie," she said. "Not a word must be said about that. But it has occurred to both Peppino and me." "But I thought you hated London," he said. "You're always so glad to get back. You find it so common and garish." "It is, compared to the exquisite peace and seriousness of our Risholme," she said, "where there never is a jarring note, at least hardly ever. But there is in London a certain stir and movement which we lack here. In the swim, Georgie, in the middle of things. Perhaps we get too sensitive here, where everything is full of harmony and culture. Perhaps we are too much sheltered. If I followed my inclination, I would never leave our dear Risholme for a single day. Oh, how easy everything would be if one only followed one's inclination. A morning with my books, an afternoon in my garden, my piano after tea, and a friend like you to come in to dine with my Peppino and me, and scold me well, as you'll soon be doing for being so bungling over Mozartino." Lucia twirled round the Elizabethan spit that hung in the wide chimney, and again fixed him rather in the style of the ancient mariner. Georgie could not choose but hear. Lucia's eloquent, well-ordered sentences had nothing impromptu about them. What she said was evidently all thought out and probably talked out. If she and Peppino had been talking of nothing else since the terrible blow had shattered them, she could not have been more lucid and crystal clear. "Georgie, I feel like a leisurely old horse who has been turned out to grass, being suddenly bridled and harnessed again. But there is work and energy in me yet, though I thought that I should be permitted to grow old in the delicious peace and leisure of our dear, quiet, humdrum Risholme. But I feel that perhaps that is not to be. My conscience is cracking the whip at me and saying, 'You've got to trot again, you lazy old thing,' and I've got to think of Peppino. Dear, contented Peppino would never complain if I refused to budge. He would read his paper and potter in the garden and write his dear little poems. Such a sweet one, Bereavement. He began it yesterday. A sonnet. And look at the stars. But is it a life for a man?" Georgie made an uneasy movement in his chair, and Lucia hastened to correct the implied criticism. "You're different, my dear," she said. "You've got that wonderful power of being interested in everything. Everything. But think what London would give Peppino. His club, the Astronomer Royal, is a member. His other club, political, and politics have lately been quite an obsession with him. The reading room at the British Museum. No, I should be very selfish if I did not see all that. I must, and I do think of Peppino. I mustn't be selfish, Georgie." This idea of Lucia's leaving Risholme was a live bomb. At the moment of its explosion, Georgie seemed to see Risholme fly into 1,000 disintegrated fragments. And then, faintly, through the smoke, he seemed to see Risholme still intact. Somebody, of course, would have to fill the vacant throne and direct its affairs. And the thought of Beau Nash at Bath flitted across the distant horizon of his mind. It was a naughty thought, but its vagueness absolved it from treason. He shook it off. "But how on earth are we to get on without you?" he asked. "Sweet of you to say that, Georgie," said she, giving another twirl to the spit. There had been a leg of mutton roasted on it last May Day, while they all sat round in jerkins and stomachers and hose, and all the perfumes of Arabia had hardly sufficed to quell the odor of roast meat which had pervaded the room for weeks afterwards. "Sweet of you to say that, but you mustn't think that I am deserting Risholme. We should be in London, perhaps, though I say nothing is settled, for 2 or 3 months in the summer, and always come here for week-ends, and perhaps from November till Christmas, and a little while in the spring. And then Risholme would always be coming up to us. 5 spare bedrooms, I believe, and one of them quite a little suite, with a bathroom and a sitting-room attached. No, dear Georgie, I would never desert my dear Risholme. If it was a choice between London and Risholme, I should not hesitate in my choice." "Then would you keep both houses open?" asked Georgie, thrilled to the marrow. "Peppino thought we could manage it," she said, utterly erasing the impression of the shattered nephew. "He was calculating it out last night, and with board wages at the other house, if you understand, and vegetables from the country, he thought that with care we could live well within our means. He got quite excited about it, and I heard him walking about long after I had gone to bed. Peppino has such a head for detail. He intends to keep a complete set of things, clothes and sponge and everything in London, so that he will have no luggage. Such a saving of tips and small expenses, in which, as he so truly says, money leaks away. Then there will be no garage expenses in London. We shall leave the motor here, and rough it with tubes and taxis in town." Georgie was full as excited as Peppino and could not be discreet any longer. "Tell me," he said, "how much do you think it will all come to? The money he'll come into, I mean." Lucia also threw discretion to the winds and forgot all about the fact that they were to be so terribly poor for a long time. "About 3,000 a year, Peppino imagines, when everything is paid. Our income will be doubled, in fact." Georgie gave a sigh of pure satisfaction. So much was revealed, not only of the future, but of the past, for no one hitherto had known what their income was. And how clever of Robert Quantock to have made so accurate a guess. "It's too wonderful for you," he said, "and I know you'll spend it beautifully. I had been thinking over it this afternoon, but I never thought it would be as much as that. And then there are the pearls. I do congratulate you." Lucia suddenly felt that she had shown too much of the silver, or was it gold, lining to the cloud of affliction that had overshadowed her. "Poor auntie," she said. "We don't forget her through it all. We hoped she might have been spared us a little longer." That came out of her note to Daisy Quantock, and perhaps to others as well, but Lucia could not have known that Georgie had already been told about that. "Now, I've come here to take your mind off these sad things," he said. "You mustn't dwell on them any longer." She rose briskly. "You've been ever so good to me," she said. "I should have just moped if I had been alone." She lapsed into some baby language which they sometimes spoke, varying it with easy Italian. "Ickle music, Georgie," she said, "and you must be kindy to me. No practice all these days. You brought Mozart? Which part is easiest? Lucia wants to take easiest part." "Lucia shall take whichever part she likes," said Georgie, who had had a good practice at both. "Treble, then," said Lucia. "But oh, how diffy it looks! Hundreds of ickle notes, and me so stupid at reading. Come on, then. You begin. Uno, due, tre." The light by the piano was not very good, but Georgie did not want to put on his spectacles unless he was obliged, for he did not think Lucia knew that he wore them, and somehow spectacles did not seem to go with Oxford trousers. But it was no good, and after having made a miserable hash of the first page, he surrendered. "Me must put on speckies," he said. "Me a blind old man." Then he had an immense surprise. "And me a blind old woman," said Lucia. "I've just got speckies too. Oh, Georgie, aren't we getting vecchio? Now we'll start again. Uno, due." The Mozart went beautifully after that, and each of them inwardly wondered at the accuracy of the other's reading. Lucia suspected that Georgie had been having a try at it, but then, after all, she had had the choice of which part she would take, and if Georgie had practiced already, he would have been almost certain to have practiced the treble. It never entered her head that he had been so thorough as to practice both. Then they played it through again, changing parts, and again it went excellently. It was late now, and soon Georgie rose to go. "And what shall I say if anybody who knows I've been dining with you asks if you've told me anything?" he asked. Lucia closed the piano and concentrated. "Say nothing of our plans about the house in Brompton Square," she said. "But there's no reason why people shouldn't know that there is a house there. I hate secretiveness, and after all, when the will comes out, everyone will know. So say there is a house there, full of beautiful things. And similarly, they will know about the money, so say what Peppino thinks it will come to." "I see," said Georgie. She came with him to the door and strolled out into the little garden in front where the daffodils were in flower. The night was clear but moonless, and the company of stars burned brightly. Aldebaran, said Lucia, pointing inclusively to the spangled arch of the sky. That bright one. Oh, Georgie, how restful it is to look at Aldebaran if one is worried and sad. It lifts one's mind above petty cares and personal sorrows. The patens of bright gold. Wonderful Shakespeare. Look in tomorrow afternoon, won't you, and tell me if there is any news. Naturally, I shan't go out. Oh, come and have lunch, said Georgie. No, dear Georgie, the funeral is at 2. Putney Vale. Buona notte. Buona notte, dear Lucia, he said. Georgie hurried back to his house and was disappointed to see that there were no lights in Daisy's drawing room nor in Robert Quantuck's study. But when he got up to his bedroom, where Foljam had forgotten to pull down the blinds, he saw a light in Daisy's bedroom. Even as he looked, the curtains there were drawn back, and he saw her amply clad in a dressing gown, opening windows at top and bottom. For just now the first principle of health consisted in sleeping in a gale. She too must have seen his room was lit, and his face at the window, for she made violent signs to him, and he threw open the casement. Well, she said. In Brompton Square, said George. And 3,000 a year. No, said Daisy. Chapter 2. This simple word, no, connotated a great deal in the Risholm vernacular. It was used, of course, as a mere negative, without emphasis, and if you wanted to give weight to your negative, you added, certainly not. But when you used the word no with emphasis, as Daisy had used it from her bedroom window to Georgie, it was not a negative at all, and its signification, briefly put, was, I never heard anything so marvelous, and it thrills me through and through. Please go on at once and tell me a great deal more, and then let's talk it all over. On that occasion, Georgie did not go on at once, for having made his climax, he, with supreme art, shut the window and drew down the blind, leaving Daisy to lie awake half the night and ponder over this remarkable news, and wonder what Peppino and Lucia would do with all that money. She arrived at several conclusions. She guessed that they would buy the meadow beyond the garden and have a new telescope, but the building of a library did not occur to her. Before she went to sleep, an even more important problem presented itself, and she scribbled a note to Georgie to be taken across in the morning early, in which she wrote, And did she say anything about the house? What's going to happen to it? And you didn't tell me the number. Exactly as she would have continued the conversation if he had not shut his window so quickly and drawn down the blind, ringing down the curtain on his magnificent climax. Foljam brought up this note with Georgie's early morning tea and the glass of very hot water, which sometimes he drank instead of it, if he suspected an error of diet the night before, and the little glass gallipot of Crucian salts, which occasionally he added to the hot water or the tea. Georgie was very sleepy, and only half awake, turned round in bed so that Foljam should not see the place where he wore the toupee, and smothered a snore, for he would not like her to think that he snored. But when she said, Telegram for you, sir, Georgie sat up at once in his pink silk pajamas. No, he said with emphasis. He tore the envelope open, and a whole sheaf of sheets fell out. The moment he set eyes on the first words, he knew so well from whom it came that he did not even trouble to look at the last sheet where it would be signed. Beloved Georgie, it ran. I rang you up till I lost my temper, and so send this. Most expensive, but terribly important. I arrived in London yesterday, and shall come down for a week-end to Risholm. Shall dine with you Saturday, all alone, to hear about everything. Come to lunch and dinner Sunday, and ask everybody to one or other, particularly Lucia. And bringing cook, but order sufficient food for Sunday. Wonderful American and Australian tour, and I'm taking house in London for season. Shall motor down. Bless you, Olga. Georgie sprang out of bed, merely glancing through Daisy's penciled note and throwing it away. There was nothing to be said to it in any case, since he had been told not to divulge the project with regard to the house in Brompton Square, and he didn't know the number. But in Olga's telegram there was enough to make anybody busy for the day, for he had to ask all her friends to lunch or dinner on Sunday, order the necessary food, and arrange a little meal for Olga and himself tomorrow night. He scarcely knew what he was drinking, tea or hot water or Crucian salts, so excited was he. He foresaw, too, that there would be call for the most skilled diplomacy with regard to Lucia. She must certainly be asked first, and some urging might be required to make her consent to come at all, either to lunch or dinner, even if due regard was paid to her deep mourning, and the festivity limited to 1 or 2 guests of her own selection. Yet somehow Georgie felt that she would stretch a point and be persuaded, for everybody else would be going sometime on Sunday to Olga's, and it would be tiresome for her to explain again and again in the days that followed that she had been asked and had not felt up to it. And if she didn't explain carefully every time, Risholm would be sure to think she hadn't been asked. A little diplomacy, thought Georgie, as he trotted across to her house after breakfast, with no hat but a fur tippet round his neck. He was shown into the music room while her maid went to fetch her. The piano was open, so she had evidently been practicing, and there was a copy of the Mozart duet which she had read so skillfully last night on the music rest. For the moment, Georgie thought he must have forgotten to take his copy away with him. But then, looking at it more carefully, he saw that there were penciled marks for the fingering scribbled over the more difficult passages in the treble, which certainly he had never put there. At the moment he saw Lucia through the window coming up the garden, and he hastily took a chair far away from the piano and buried himself in the Times. They sat close together in front of the fire, and Georgie opened his errand. "I heard from Olga this morning," he said. "A great long telegram. She is coming down for the weekend." Lucia gave a wintry smile. She did not care for Olga's coming down. Risholm was quite silly about Olga. "That will be nice for you, Georgie," she said. "She sent you a special message," said he. "I am grateful for her sympathy," said Lucia. "She might perhaps have written direct to me, but I'm sure she was full of kind intentions. As she sent the message by you verbally, will you verbally thank her? I appreciate it." Even as she delivered these icy sentiments, Lucia got up rather hastily and passed behind him. Something white on the music rest of the piano had caught her eye. "Don't move, Georgie," she said. "Sit and warm yourself and light your cigarette. Anything else?" She walked up the room to the far end where the piano stood, and Georgie, though he was a little deaf, quite distinctly heard the rustle of paper. The most elementary rudiments of politeness forbade him to look around. Besides, he knew exactly what was happening. Then there came a second rustle of paper which he could not interpret. "Anything else, Georgie?" repeated Lucia, coming back to her chair. "Yes, but Olga's message wasn't quite that," he said. "She evidently hadn't heard of your bereavement." "Odd," said Lucia. "I should have thought perhaps that the death of Miss Amy Lucas. However, what was her message then?" "She wanted you very much. She said particularly Lucia, to go to lunch or dine with her on Sunday. Peppino too, of course." "So kind of her, but naturally quite impossible," said Lucia. "Oh, but you mustn't say that," said Georgie. "She is down for just that day, and she wants to see all her old friends. Particularly Lucia, you know. In fact, she asked me to get up 2 little parties for her at lunch and dinner. So, of course, I came to see you first, to know which you would prefer." Lucia shook her head. "A party," she said. "How do you think I could?" "But it wouldn't be that sort of party," said Georgie. Just a few of your friends. You and Peppino will have seen nobody tonight and all tomorrow. He will have told you everything by Sunday. It's so bad to sit brooding." The moment Lucia had said it was quite impossible. She had been longing for Georgie to urge her, and had indeed been prepared to encourage him to urge her if he didn't do so of his own accord. His last words had given her an admirable opening. "I wonder," she said, "perhaps Peppino might feel inclined to go, if there really was no party. It doesn't do to brood, you are right. I mustn't let him brood. Selfish of me not to think of that." "Who would there be, Georgie?" "That's really for you to settle," he said. "You?" she asked. "Yes," said Georgie, thinking it unnecessary to add that Olga was dining with him on Saturday, and that he would be at lunch and dinner on Sunday. "Yes, she's asked me to come." "Well, then, what if you asked poor Daisy and her husband?" said Lucia. "It would be a treat for them. That would make 6. I think 6 would be enough. I will do my best to persuade Peppino." "Capital," said Georgie. "And would you prefer lunch or dinner?" Lucia sighed. "I think dinner," she said. "One feels more capable of making the necessary effort in the evening, but of course it is all conditional on Peppino's feeling." She glanced at the clock. "He will just be leaving Brompton Square," she said, "and then, afterwards, his lawyer is coming to lunch with him and have a talk. Such a lot of business to see to." Georgie suddenly remembered that he did not yet know the number of the house. "Indeed, there must be," he said. "Such a delightful square, but rather noisy, I should think, at the lower end." "Yes, but deliciously quiet at the top end," said Lucia. "A curve, you know, and a cul-de-sac. Number 25 is just before the beginning of the curve, and no houses at the back. Just a peaceful old churchyard, though sad for Peppino to look out on this morning, and a footpath only up to Ennismore Gardens. My music room looks out at the back." Lucia rose. "Well, Georgie, you will be very busy this morning," she said, "getting all the guests for Sunday, and I mustn't keep you. But I should like to play you a morsel of Stravinsky, which I have been trying over. Terribly modern, of course, and it may sound hideous to you at first, and at best it's a mere little tinkle if you compare it with the immortals. But there is something about it, and one mustn't condemn all modern work unheard. There was a time, no doubt, when even Beethoven's greatest sonatas were thought to be modern and revolutionary." She led the way to the piano, where on the music rest was the morsel of Stravinsky, which explained the second and hitherto unintelligible rustle. "Sit by me, Georgie," she said, "and turn over quick when I nod. Something like this." Lucia got through the first page beautifully, but then everything seemed to go wrong. Georgie had expected it all to be odd and aimless, but surely Stravinsky hadn't meant quite what Lucia was playing. Then he suddenly saw that the key had been changed, but in a very inconspicuous manner right in the middle of a bar, and Lucia had not observed this. She went on playing with amazing agility, nodded at the end of the second page, and then, luckily, the piece changed back again into its original clef. Would it be wise to tell her? He thought not. Next time she tried it, or the time after, she would very likely notice a change of key. A brilliant roulade consisting of chromatic scales and contrary directions brought this firework to an end, and Lucia gave a little shiver. "I must work at it," she said, "before I can judge of it." Her fingers strayed about the piano, and she paused. Then, with the wistful expression Georgie knew so well, she played the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata. Georgie set his face also into the Beethoven expression, and at the end gave the usual little sigh. "Divine," he said. "You never played it better." Thank you, Lucia." She rose. "You must thank immortal Beethoven," she said,